Hey guys, welcome back to another very exciting tutorial here at the PhotoshopTrainingChannel.com. My name is Jesus Ramirez and you can find me on Twitter at JR from PTC. In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at most of the new features in Adobe Photoshop CC 2014. If you're a member of the Creative Cloud, then you already have access to this new version of Photoshop. In this new version, the basic interface and features mostly remain the same, but it includes over a dozen new features and feature improvements, such as improvements with smart guides, smart objects, fonts, and the blur gallery. One thing to keep in mind is that this update is a new release, which means that a new version of Photoshop will be installed. So any plugins or add-ons you had in your previous version of Photoshop CC will need to be reinstalled. You may also want to uninstall the older version of Photoshop from your computer, since you probably won't be using it anymore. Okay, so let's get started with the tutorial. In this video, we're going to be talking about the path blur and the radial blur, which are two new additions to the blur gallery in Photoshop CC 2014. So let me show you how they work. We're going to start out by clicking on this smart object here labeled street, and I'm going to go into filter, blur gallery, and click on path blur. This is going to open up the path blur panel here on the right side, and it has different options, and you see the path here. The way this works is by selecting the speed of the blur, and this is a global change, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. So I'm just going to increase the speed so you can see how that works. You can also increase or decrease the taper, like so. And when the taper does is it increases or decreases the edges of the blur. We have the center blur, which means that the blur samples from both sides of the pixel when it's on. When it's checked off, it only samples one side. You can see the arrows pointing to the right, so the pixels are only being pushed to the right. If I do center, there's pixels going left and right. You can also adjust the endpoint speed, which is the points here, these white dots. If you click on one, you'll see a blue dot inside of that white one, and that means that this is selected. And this is now enabled. I can increase or decrease the speed of that endpoint. As you can see, this red arrow is telling us the speed of the blur. I can also click on this point here and reduce the speed. So now we have less blur on one side and more blur on the other. I can click and drag these points, and you'll see that there's more blur on the right side than on the left. That's because we controlled the points independently. The speed up here controls the global speed. The speed here at the bottom controls the speed of the actual points. You can also click anywhere on this path and add a new point. You can click and drag that down, or you can create a new one and drag it up, and you can create this motion blur along this path. You can also click anywhere else on your image and create a new path. If you want to stop creating points, you can simply hover over the last point you created until you get that black icon under your arrow, and you can click on it, and that will exit you out of the path creation tool. You can also click on a point and delete one by selecting it and then hitting the delete key on the keyboard. And if you delete all the points, it will delete the path. To stop creating points, instead of coming over to the icon and clicking on it, you can also press enter on your keyboard, and that will create the path for you. I'm going to select this point, and I'm just going to delete it, and I'm going to delete all these points, and we're going to start again from scratch. Now, one thing you can do with this tool is create motion on this image. So I'm actually going to cancel this for now. I have this car here, and we're going to create a composition where it's going to look like this car is coming really fast on the street. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some path blurs to create that effect. So I'm going to go into filter, gallery, path blur, and I'm just going to create a path that sort of follows this sidewalk. So I'm going to move that down here, and maybe I'll even push this one down further and create a path here like so. And you don't have to be running the line as long as you get these lines going there. And I'm going to create one more. It's going to come from here to here, and maybe, and I'm going to press enter, I'm going to click and drag the center point here and move it over to the right, just so we can create more of that motion on the street. I like the way the street is looking, but I don't like the way the buildings are looking. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create straight lines just to sort of straighten out the blur on the side of the street, like so. And I'll do the same thing on this side. And maybe I can add one here for the sidewalk, like so. Press enter. Now if you start creating a lot of paths and you really can't see your composition, you can always press Ctrl H, so you can hide those elements and you can see what you created. So as you can see, we have created speed on this image, and also here where the car is turning, we created this motion that is turning along with the street, which is looking pretty good. I'm going to press Ctrl H to bring those paths back. One thing you can do is you can click on the points here and you can increase or reduce the speed accordingly. So I might increase it just a little bit, maybe something like that. Okay, so I think this is looking pretty good. I'm just going to press OK to accept the changes. And now let's work with the car. What I'm going to do with the car is I'm going to select it, and I'm going to zoom in by holding Alt mouse wheel to zoom in, Option on the Mac. And I'm just going to make a selection around the tire, like so. And I'm going to press Ctrl J, Command J on the Mac to make a duplicate. So now I have a duplicate tire. If I disable the car, you can see it. And I'm going to convert this into a smart object. Then I'm going to go into Filter, Blur Gallery, and now we're going to be looking at another new feature, the spin blur. And it's going to make it look like the tire is spinning. So you can click and drag this down and sort of shape it into the shape of that tire, and it'll sort of look like that tire is spinning. You can change the blur angle, match it better there. So something along those lines will work. So I'm just going to press OK to accept the changes. Now it looks like that tire is spinning. One thing you might want to do is create a layer mask with a black brush. You may want to bring like part of that car. My flow is set to 12%, so I can increase it to 100% so that brush works better. So something like that. I'll change it to white to bring some of that blur back on some of the areas, like right there. And you can do the same thing for the back tire if you want to. I'm not going to, just for the sake of time. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to click on the car layer, and I'm going to add another path blur. Something like this. Maybe push this back and sort of move that around like so. I'm just trying to find the right angle. Maybe I can click on this one here and reduce the speed of the point. That might work. I'm just going to press OK. Now there's one problem right here, which is this tire there. We created a layer mask, but we didn't properly hide all the elements. So I'm going to hide this part here by painting with black. Okay, I can zoom out. If you want to make any changes to this blur, you can by using the Smart Filter layer mask, and if you paint with black on that layer mask, you can start bringing some detail back if you want to. Oh, actually I was painting on the wrong layer mask. You gotta click on this Smart Filter layer mask, and then you can bring back some details if you want to. If you do this, however, you might not want to paint with black, and if you do, you might want to reduce the flow so you don't paint with 100% black. That way you're painting with gray, and you can sort of build up to black. That way you can create a smoother transition. But anyway, one other thing I want to show you before I let you go is on the blur gallery. And I'm going to show you on this section here, because we have a lot of paths to work with. You can click on a point, and you can also click on edit blur shapes, and this will edit the shape of that blur. You have 2 points. You have the end point here and this part here. So if you look on the ground here, you can kind of see these U looking shapes. That was a straight line, but we changed the shape of the blur that changes the shape of these lines, as you can see here. I can bring that in, maybe move it around, You can create some really interesting blurs just by editing the blur shapes. So I'm just going to disable this for now. Obviously, this is not the way I originally wanted it. To get rid of these, you can just click on them and hit delete, and they go away. A few other settings you can play with is the basic blur, which is what we've been working with. You can also change that to rear sync flash, which you can sort of see it here. All these paths have an arrow at the end. They're all pointing towards the outside of the image. I can easily make these point inside, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is with rear sync flash, the blur only goes one direction, and that's the direction that the arrow is pointing to on the path. So you can create some pretty cool effects with this as well, and that's by using the rear sync flash. Basic blur just does a blur on both sides. You also have the motion blur effects, and you can change the strobe strength. Notice if I bring it all the way up to 100, you sort of get this double vision look. If I bring it down to 0 on this side, it removes all the blur. But if I start adding some strobe flashes, you can see the light posts here duplicating. Now I have 3. At this point I had 2. If I bring it all the way to the end, it's just one seamless blur. So you can play around with these settings to get the appropriate effect that you're going for. I'm just going to cancel out of this because I don't want to save any of those changes. But there you have it. That's the new path blur and radio blur in Adobe Photoshop CC 2014. Another new feature in Adobe Photoshop CC 2014 is the focus mask. It's a tool that allows you to create a mask or selection out of an object that Photoshop thinks is in focus in an image. Let me show you how that works. We have this photograph here of a flower. As you can see, the flower is in focus and the background is not in focus. So we can actually tell Photoshop to make a selection of the focus object here in this image. To do so, you can go into Select, click on Focus Area, and when this window comes up, you'll see this icon here spinning, letting you know that it's calculating what is in focus and what it's not. So as you can see, Photoshop made a selection out of the flower because it was in focus and did not select the background because it was out of focus. There's different view modes, much like the Refine Edge. You can have marching ants, overlay, which is what I had before, which is very similar to Quick Mask, on a black background, on a white background, on a mask, on layers, or just the entire image. For this tutorial, let's leave it in overlay so we can see what's going on. Everything that's red is not going to be selected. So we can see that although this is a very good tool, it didn't do a good job here, which is why we have these two brushes here, a focus area add tool and a focus area subtract tool. The add tool adds to the selection, as you can see here. And if you make a mistake, maybe Photoshop selected this area which is not part of the flower, you can either click on the brush, or while the add selection tool is active, hold Alt Option on the Mac to temporarily toggle to the subtraction tool, and you can just subtract that from the selection. And you can just make any adjustments you see fit on your image. And I think I need to select maybe this part here, something like this part here. And you know what, I see some red here, so I'm gonna make some selections here. And I did a little too much there, so I'm gonna subtract that. And I'm still not quite getting this section right. But anyway, I think this is gonna work for the tutorial. Another thing you can do is you can change the focus range. You can either reduce it or increase it. But so far I found that just leaving the auto checkbox on does a good job. You also have the advanced options here, which include the image noise levels. And again, leaving it in auto should be okay for most occasions. Unless you have a really noisy image, you can play around with the sliders if you like. You can output the object in focus as a selection, a layer mask, a new layer with layer mask, a new document, or a new document with layer mask. For now, I'm just going to leave it as a selection. Also, one other thing I like doing a lot of the times is clicking on the soften edge checkbox so the edges get softer and they're not as jaggy. Here, let me uncheck that. You can probably see it up here. Once I check the checkbox, the edges here are so much smoother and the darkness around the flower disappears. Now I'm going to click on the OK button, and you're going to see the selection around the flower. And from here I can create a layer mask if I wanted to, but I probably don't want to do that because I had the option in the previous screen. It'll make more sense if I created something like a hue saturation adjustment layer. Then I can decrease the saturation of the image, but I probably would want to desaturate the background, not the foreground, for this effect. So I'm going to click on the layer mask, then click on invert. I could have also clicked on the layer mask and press Control-I, Command-I on the Mac to invert. I'm going to go ahead and collapse the properties panel just so we can see the image. I can now come in and zoom into the flower and look for any mistakes, like in this part here. And this is just a regular layer mask, so I can paint with white to continue desaturating the background in areas where the focus mask didn't do that good of a job. But as you can see, overall it did a great job selecting the item that was in focus. Even here, the focus mask did a great job, as you can see. And it looks good overall. Obviously, it's a very simple effect, but you can use this very same technique to make selections that can get complicated in an easy way. In Photoshop CC 2014, there's also been improvements in Content Aware. The improvements are in the Fill dialog box, also with the Patch tool, and the Content Aware Move tool. Let me show you how it works. I have this image here of this young lady doing yoga, but maybe I want to remove her out of the image because I just want the beach scene. And actually, one of the things I could do is select her, and before I select her, I'm actually going to make a duplicate of this layer. I'm going to select it and press Control-J, Command-J on the Mac, just so you can see the difference. And I'm just going to click on the polygonal lasso tool and make a quick selection around her. I kind of made a mistake there, but I can fix that after I'm done creating the selection. I missed this part of her hair. You can add to the selection by holding Shift and just create a selection around the area that you miss. You can also hold Alt, Option on the Mac, to subtract from the selection. So I'm going to subtract from this part here. Okay, so now that I've selected her, I can go into Edit, Fill, and use Content Aware to fill this selection. Photoshop will then analyze the pixels of the image and make a fill based on those pixels. I'm going to press Control-D, Command-D to deselect. And as you can see, it did a fairly decent job of removing her out of the image, but you can still see some lines here, some very sharp lines where the fill took place. In Photoshop CC 2014, we can actually fix that from the Fill dialog box. And here's a little trick for you. If you want to bring the last selection that you use, you can go into Select, Reselect, or you can press Shift Control D, that's Shift Command D on the Mac, to bring back the last selection that you use. And this actually brings back the last selection that you use, no matter how many other things you've done in Photoshop. So you could have created a whole bunch of layers, apply different effects, use a lot of different tools, but Photoshop will always remember the last selection that you use. Anyway, so this is the same selection. I'm going to go into Edit, Fill, and this time I'm going to click on this checkbox here, Color Adaptation. I'm still going to use Content Aware, and I'm going to press OK. I'm going to press Control D to deselect, and you'll see the difference. The lines that were here before, they're not as sharp. There's a much smoother transition. So here's the before, and here's the after. You can really see it here. There's a really sharp line right here that comes along this part of the sky and into the water here. And that's completely gone when we use the color adaptation checkbox. I'm also going to show you some of the new enhancements in Content Aware with the Patch tool and the Content Aware Move tool. So for that, we're going to use this image here. This is obviously not a great image, but let's imagine that we want to work with this image, but we want to remove this sticker here. So what we can do is we can click on the Patch tool found here under the Spot Healing Brush tool, and we can make a selection out of it. Of course, you can just click and drag around the object that you want to remove from your image. So I'm just going to make a quick selection here. Now in this image, we have no room to select from any of these orange areas, which would be ideal, but we can come into this white part, which will give us some of the texture of the wall, and it would be a good area to select from. So I'm just going to drop the selection here. Photoshop is going to analyze the pixels, and I'm going to press Control H, Command H on the Mac to hide the selections. That way we can see it better. So the selection is still there, it's just hidden. And what we can do now is use the new adaptation settings. First we have the structure, With the structure, you can enter any value between 1 and 5 to specify how closely the patch should reflect existing image patterns. So if you enter 5, the patch adheres very strongly to the patterns existing on this image. If you enter 1, then it would loosely adhere to the patterns. So why don't we just select 1 so you can see what happens, and then I'll press 5. So you can see with the 5, the patterns of this image made it all the way to this side. And you can see here with this crack, it sort of looks like a Y. That's this crack here. This dot, they're also here. So 5 will pretty much bring anything from the source area. Then we have color. With color, you can enter any value between 0 and 10 to specify the extent to which you want Photoshop to apply the algorithmic color blending to the patch. So that means that if you enter 0, color blending is completely disabled. And if you enter 10, it applies maximum color blending. So I'll press 0 so you can see what that looks like. You see there's no color blending going on whatsoever. And if I set the color to 10, the color blending is to the maximum, and that completely removes the stickers. So as you can see, with the new adaptation options, you can work on the fly and select different settings to get the results that you want. Also, just to let you know, the same applies for the Content Aware Move tool. It also has the adaptation options. So if you're moving one object to another area of your image, you can also use the structure and color settings to help you blend the pixels better and get a better match on your move. In this section, we're going to talk about Smart Object improvements. In Photoshop CC 2014, we have a new feature for Smart Objects, and that's the package option you see here. Now, before I go into the package option, I'm going to talk about how linked and embedded Smart Objects work. That way you can better understand how the package works. In Photoshop 14.2, we got the Place Linked Smart Object feature. And in previous versions of Photoshop where Smart Objects have been available, they've always been embedded. And let me show you how that works. This is the cover for my Facebook page, and I have my logo on it. If you notice here, this logo has the link icon here, which means that it's a linked Smart Object. I also have this template where I do my tip of the day on Pinterest. It also goes on my Facebook page, but I create a Pinterest image so people are able to save those tips of the day on their Pinterest account. But anyway, I have the same logo here, and it's also a linked Smart Object to this file here, this logo.png. So what that means is that that same file is being displayed on the footer here and on the side here. If I were to click on the linked Smart Object and click on the Properties panel, you can see that I can click on this button here titled Edit Contents. That's going to open up that file. Any changes I make to this file will also be displayed on the Photoshop tip template and on the Facebook cover. Let me show you how that works. I'm just going to create a hue and saturation layer, and I'm going to move this hue slider over to the right. And I'm just going to merge those two actually. So I'm going to select both of them, press Control E, Command E on the Mac. I'm going to press Control S, Command S on the Mac to save. Then if I move over to my Photoshop tip template, you'll see that the logo is now pink. And the same thing goes for the Facebook cover. So that's how linked Smart Object works. We have a file in our hard drive, and we have a linked file in this composition that references that file. And the same thing goes for the Facebook cover. If I press Control Alt Z to undo and come back to the original color, I can press Control S, save that file, and you'll see that it's back to blue here. I'm just going to go ahead and close these files and not save them. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change the color again. For this time, I'm just going to go to Image, Adjustment, Hue Saturation, and I'm just going to make it orange this time. And I'm going to save it, Control S, Command S on the Mac. Then I'm going to open up the Photoshop tip template. But you'll notice that the logo is still blue. But if you click on the link Smart Object, you'll see that there's this yellow icon giving us a warning. And you'll see that in Properties panel here, it's telling us that this linked object has not been updated. So what you can do is you can go into Layer, Smart Objects, update modified content, or update all modified content, and it's going to update that file on this document to reflect the changes. I'm just going to go ahead and close this, not save it, and I'm going to press Ctrl-Alt-C to undo. I'll save that, and then I'm going to go into File, Open, and I'm just going to rename this file. I'm just going to add a 1, and I'm going to cancel this out. And I can actually close this. I don't need it anymore. If I go to File, Open, and open the Facebook cover, Photoshop is telling me that it cannot locate the link file. If you notice here, there's a red icon now telling me that there's something going on, and you see it here in the Properties panel as well. If I try to make a change, like transform it, so I'm going to press Ctrl-T to transform, it's going to tell me that I cannot transform because the linked smart object file is missing. So I either need to rasterize it or I need to find it. So I'm going to find it. I'm going to go into Layer, Smart Objects, Resolve Broken Link, and I'm going to click on the file, click on Place, and that file has been restored. Now I can go ahead and make any changes I want to and keep working with the file. Now, the reason I showed you all of this is so you understand how the new feature works, the package feature. If you are saving a PSD and you have linked smart objects, then you need to make sure that you save those smart objects as well. If you want to email this PSD, or you want to move it into a different computer, maybe you want to put it on your hard drive and take it to your office, or from your office to your home, you need to make sure you include the linked smart objects as well so the file works. So what Photoshop allows you to do now is package the files together for you. So you can select the folder on your hard drive, or you can make a new folder. I'm just going to choose this assets folder here and press OK. Now what Photoshop did is it created this folder here. The folder is the title of the file, so in my case Facebook cover, and then it appends the word folder onto it. If you open it up, you'll see the PSD, and you'll see this folder titled Links, which contain all the link files. That way, if you're moving around PSDs that include linked smart objects, you still have them available when you need them. So it's just an easier way of keeping track of linked smart objects. Another thing you can do in Photoshop CC 2014 is create a linked smart object from a smart object. So I'm going to right click on the background layer here. I'm going to convert it into a smart object. And I know we've been talking about smart objects for a while now, but just in case you don't know what a smart object is, it's a sort of a shell that you can apply distortions or filters, and they're non-destructive. So I'll quickly show you how that works. That it's now a smart object. I can go into Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, blur it out, and this blur is non-destructive. I can double click on the Gaussian blur title here to bring up the filter and blur it more or blur it less. I also have a mask here for this filter, and if I paint with black, you'll see that I get rid of that blur. If I paint with white, I bring that blur back. I also have this icon here which allows me to set the blending mode for that blur. So maybe I want to have a different blending mode for that. When I switch the blending modes around, I get a different effect. I can also change the opacity of that blur. So I'm just going to keep that at normal and then press OK. But anyway, once you have a smart object, now in Photoshop CC 2014, you can right click on it and you can convert it to a linked smart object, which essentially is going to save a file onto your computer and it's going to reference it. So now you see the little link icon here like we had with the logo. So if I click on that and then click on the Properties panel, I can edit its contents if I wanted to edit the background. Photoshop CC 2014 also gave us some improvements in layer comps. Layer comps have been around forever, but they do have a lot of great new features in the new version of Photoshop. If you're not familiar with layer comps, I'll quickly show you how they work. I have the layer comps panel open. If you don't have that open, you can go into Window, Layer Comps, and layer comps allow us to create different views of a file that we're working on to present to a client or to somebody who's overseeing the project that you're working on. And let me show you how that works. I'm going to click on this icon here to create a new layer comp, and I'm going to name this layer comp blue background. With layer comps, you can save the visibility, the position, the appearance, which is the layer style of a layer. You can also give a comment to the layer comp which explains the changes. You can leave it blank if you want to. I'm going to do so because my name is very descriptive of the change. I don't really think I need to add any other comment. So I'm going to press OK. So now I have a blue background. Actually, I misspelled it, but I can double click on it to fix it and add D. So now I have my blue background layer comp. And I can go into background and enable this layer here, orange BG, which is going to give me an orange background. So now I have two different versions of the file that I'm working on. I'm working one with a blue background and one with an orange background. And that's what layer comps allow us to do, to take one file that we're working with and enable and disable layers so we can see different looks and styles before we decide on a final composition. I'm going to click on this icon here and I'm going to name this new layer comp orange background. And I'm going to enable the visibility, position, and appearance and no comments. Press OK. So now I have a blue background layer composition and an orange background layer composition. And if you notice, when I click on these boxes here, the visibility eyeball icon here shuts on and off depending on the layers that I want visible. And I also can click on the icons here to toggle the visibility, position, or appearance of the layer composition. And by the way, if I click on the name, it doesn't change. You have to click on the icon here to toggle between layer compositions. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to select the logo and move it. And I know this doesn't look great, but it's going to demonstrate some of the new tools in the layer comps panel, which are these tools here at the bottom. So I made a movement. I moved the logo from the top left to the bottom right. I'm also going to double click on it, click on drop shadow, and I'm just going to add a drop shadow that's very noticeable there just so you can see what's going on. And I'm also going to drop down the opacity a little bit. Okay, so these are the changes that I made to that layer. If I click on this icon here while the orange background layer comp is selected, it's going to update all three options: the visibility, the position, and the appearance, which are the layer styles. So I'm going to click on that, and now you'll notice that the icon moved here to the bottom and it's selecting it. So it made those changes to my composition. Now I'm going to do that again. I'm going to move the position somewhere else, maybe here. I'm going to increase the opacity to 100%, and I'm going to change the drop shadow to this side over here. And I'm going to press OK. So now I made changes to the visibility, the position, and the appearance. But now I realized that I was happy with the previous visibility and the previous appearance. So I only want to apply the movement. So I can click on this icon here to only apply the movement. And when I click on the orange background composition, you'll see that the transparency is back and that the layer style drop shadow was at the previous setting. So Photoshop only updated the position. I could have done the same thing for the visibility, or I could have done the same thing for the layer styles or the appearance, or I could have done all three by clicking on this icon. So these are some of the new features in layer comps in Photoshop CC 2014. You have those same options here. Now, another thing that's new in Adobe Photoshop CC 2014, which is actually pretty cool. In a previous video, we talked about linked smart objects, like the logo here. We saw this before. If I click on the Properties panel, I can edit the contents of that logo here. I can click on Hue and Saturation and change the color of that logo to maybe red. And I can also create layer comps. So I'm going to create a layer comp. I'm going to add a new layer comp and call this red logo. Press OK. I'm going to disable this layer and create a new layer comp and call it blue logo. Control S to save, Command S on the Mac. Now back at the Photoshop tip of the day template, click on the logo to make sure it's selected, and this is the link smart object. And we're going to click on the Properties panel, and under this drop down menu here, we can select the red logo right here, as you can see, and we can select the blue logo. So Photoshop CC 2014 allows us to select which layer comp to choose from in a link smart object, giving us far more flexibility to create some complex layer comps so you can show them to your clients or whoever is overseeing your project. Now, a lot of times clients may not have Photoshop, and you can't just give them a PSD file and tell them to click on properties and click on all these different options for them to see. But what you can do is go into File, Scripts. You can turn your layer comps into files like JPEGs, for example, or maybe PNGs, but I think JPEGs is fine if you're going to be emailing them and sending them off to a client. You can also convert them into PDFs as well, so that way you can email all of them to your client or art director. One of my favorite additions to Photoshop CC 2014 comes in with type, specifically speaking with fonts. So I have this sample file here that we're going to work on to complete this tutorial, and it has just a background layer and a text layer with my website, photoshoptrainingchannel.com. And if I select the text tool while the text layer is selected, I can come here to the font drop down, and one of the new additions is that when you hover over the fonts, Photoshop will automatically give you a nice preview of what that font is. Because of that, the sample fonts here on the side, they become a little redundant, so it's probably best to remove them. So why don't we remove that so we can see what's going on a little bit better. So I'm going to click on type, then I'm going to go into font preview, and I'm just going to select none. When I open up the drop down menu again, you'll see that the samples are gone here on the side, and it gives us a little bit more room to work with. That way we can see what our font will ultimately look like. Once you find a font that you're happy with, you can just click on it, and that will be the new font for the text layer. You can also come to the font drop down box here, and you can start typing names of fonts, and Photoshop will automatically start populating the list with fonts that only include that name, for example Arial. You can also type attributes such as italic, and it will give you the fonts that have italics. You can also combine attributes such as italics and maybe bold. And you can also start typing the name of a font. So maybe I want an italic bold Arial. And then Photoshop gives me that option, and I can click on it and select it and change the font on that. So it makes searching for fonts a whole lot easier. Like I said before, maybe you just want the bold italic font. You can just come and hover over those bold italic fonts and find the one that works best for you. So maybe this is the one I like. Now, my favorite addition in fonts for Photoshop CC 2014 comes with Typekit. By the way, just notice right now that this filter is a filter button that filters Typekit only fonts. If I click on it, it says no matches found. That's because I don't have any Typekit fonts, but I will add some now so you can see how that works. I'm going to click on this icon here, and this is Typekit. But before I continue with this, I just want to remind you that if you get an error saying that Photoshop cannot connect to Creative Cloud, make sure that your Creative Cloud app is turned on. And this is the same app where you install and update your Creative Cloud programs. So make sure that's turned on and connected to the internet. So once you click on that green Typekit button, it's going to bring you directly into typekit.com, where you can add desktop fonts to your Photoshop installation. You can filter those fonts by their type, for example, sans serif, serif, maybe even handwritten fonts or decorative fonts. So why don't we look at a handwritten font? So I click on that, and this is going to show me all the available handwritten font styles that are available in Typekit. By the way, you can also adjust by properties, for example, weight, width, contrast, height, and many different other options. So once you find a font that you want to use in your Photoshop installation, just hover over it and click on Use Fonts. So I'm going to select this one here, Felt Tip Roman. I'm going to click on that, and it's going to ask me what I want to sync, the regular or bold or both. So I'm going to leave both checked so I can install both onto my computer. I'm going to click on Sync Selected Fonts, and I can just click on Close when that's done. You can't see it now, but I just got a notification on my status bar saying that 2 fonts were added. If I click on it, it brings up my Creative Cloud app, and it lets me know that the fonts were synced. This means that the fonts are now on my computer. So if I go back into Photoshop, I can come into the drop-down menu here, and because I have the filter selected, it's showing me only the Typekit fonts, which include the fonts that we just installed. So I have the regular and bold version of that handwritten font. If I wanted to remove a font that I installed via Typekit, I can bring back my app. This is my Creative Cloud app that I spoke about earlier, and I can click on Manage Fonts. This is going to bring up a web page on typekit.com that's going to have all the sync fonts to my Creative Cloud account, and I can just click on Remove, and it's going to remove the font from my Creative Cloud account. If I come back into Photoshop, you'll notice that now there's a bracket around the font here and a warning telling us that the font has been uninstalled. So if I were to come in here and try to type something, it won't let me. It's telling me that the font cannot be found and that a substitution will occur. If I press OK, I can add more characters, but it will no longer be in that font. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to press Ctrl-Alt-C to undo the changes till I get back into the felt-tip Roman bold font, where Photoshop is letting me know that the font is missing. And I'm just going to go ahead and save it, and then I'm going to close it. Then I'm going to reopen it again. And Photoshop is going to tell me that my document is missing fonts. Typekit is on, and Photoshop will look through Typekit to see if it can find it. If it does, I can select it, and then I can click on Resolve Fonts, and then Photoshop will resync that font onto my installation. I could also choose not to resolve the issue, or I can choose Myriad Pro or Regular to replace that font. In this case, I'm going to click on Fill Tip Roman Bold because I want Photoshop to resolve the issue. Then I'll click on Resolve Fonts. It will take a minute, but Photoshop will sync the font and the warning will be gone, and I can come back here and edit the font. Now obviously I knew that that font was going to be available in Typekit because that's where we got it from, but a lot of times you may get a file from somebody else and the fonts that they use may or may not be on Typekit, but if they are, you can go ahead and sync those if you want to. One of the first enhancements that you'll notice in Photoshop CC 2014 is going to be the Smart Guides. They're these visual cues that help you align or space objects in Photoshop. Let me show you how they work. I'm going to select the Move tool, and in this tutorial you can do one of two things. You can click on the Auto Select option here. That allows you to select a layer or a group. We're going to click on Layer. When you click on it on the canvas, for example, if I click on this red square, you'll notice that in the Layers panel that square is going to be selected. I can do the same thing for the triangle, and I can do the same thing for the circle, and it will select it automatically. I personally don't like this feature because sometimes I accidentally click and drag on the wrong object, and it's just more work for me. So I'm just going to go ahead and disable that. You can enable it if you want to. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to hold Control, Command and the Mac, and I can click to select the square, click to select the circle, or click to select the triangle. Now you probably noticed these magenta visual guides that you see here. Those are the new Smart Guides, and if I hold Control, Command and the Mac and hover over my object, you'll see an outline which is the space that this object is taking. If I hover outside of the object, you'll see the distance in pixels to the canvas. And by the way, it's set to pixels because that's what my rulers are set to. If I change my rulers to inches, for example, come back and do the same thing, you'll see that the guides now are set in inches. If your rulers are not enabled, you can enable them by pressing Control-R, Command-R on the Mac, and you can also do the same thing to disable them. I'm going to set mine back to pixels. Right-click and select pixels. If I hover over another object, it'll tell me the difference between the object that is selected and the object that I'm hovering over. As you can see here, the distance between the triangle and the square is 372 pixels. And by the way, I'm still holding Control, Command on the Mac. I'm not letting go of that key. And when I'm in this mode, I can also use the arrow keys on my keyboard to nudge the currently selected layer. For example, I'm pressing the left arrow key and now I'm moving closer into the circle. If I press the right arrow key, I'm moving further away, and the display tells me how many pixels it is away from the square. If I shut off the visibility to the circle and the triangle, and I select the square, I can hold Alt to duplicate, and I'm sure you know that's nothing new, that's been in Photoshop forever, but what is new is if I click and drag, you'll see the Smart Guides telling me the distance between the original object and the duplicate. So if I set it to 80 pixels, I can create another duplicate, and this time, when I get to 80 pixels, Photoshop will snap the third object at 80 pixels. So I'm just going to let go of that. Smart guides also work with shapes, so let me go ahead and create a shape so we can work with that. I'm going to use a rounded rectangle, and I'm just going to draw a shape. And if I select the path selection tool, which is the black arrow, I can hold Alt, and I can also duplicate that shape onto the same layer, and you'll notice that Photoshop also gives me the smart guides just as it did with layers. I'm just going to go ahead and close that so we can see what's going on. If I hold Control, Command on the Mac, I still get the same visual aids as I did when I was working with the Move tool in layers. If I hold Shift and move this over, you'll see Photoshop tell me when the three objects have the same space in between each other. In this case, 74 pixels. And by the way, all these are in the same layer. If you're working with shapes, just remember that you have to be in the Path Selection tool. You sometimes may be on the Shape tool, and that won't work. Smart Guides only work with the Direct Selection tool and with the Move tool. If you like guides but you don't like this magenta color and you want to switch the color, you can press Control K, Command K on the Mac to bring up the preferences window, and you can select guides, grids, and slices, and under Smart Guides you can change the color to something else. I like mine at magenta, but there might be a project where you need to change it to something else. In Adobe Photoshop CC 2014, we also get an improvement with the Generator plugin. If you've never used Photoshop Generator before, then check out my tutorial on that. I did a tutorial where I talked about the ins and outs of Generator. So I'm not going to cover every single feature of Generator in this tutorial, but I will tell you enough about Generator and how it works. That way you understand the update. So the first thing we need to do before you get started is make sure you have Generator enabled. To do that, you can press Control K, Command K on the Mac to bring the Preferences panel. Under Plugins, make sure that the Enable Generator checkbox is checked. And then go into File, Generate, and click on Image Assets. Once you've done that, we're ready to start. So what is Generator? Well, Generator allows you to create assets for websites or apps or games in a much easier and effective way. So I have this mock-up here. It's just a website for a fictitious company. It's not a real company. And if I wanted to generate the assets for my website, in the past I will need to go into my slice tool and slice this up and export those into JPEGs or PNGs. Now with Adobe Generator, I can simply rename the layer and Photoshop will export that for me automatically. And if I make a change to that layer, Photoshop will update it automatically as well. So I can click on my banner here and go all the way to the image of my banner. And by the way, notice that the banner has a lot of adjustment layers applied to it to give it the blue look we have here. But if I simply rename the layer to banner.jpg and bring the folder where my PSD resides in, you'll see that there's a folder called Water Dancer Site Assets. Those are the assets that Photoshop is generating for us automatically. I'm going to go ahead and open that up, and you'll see the banner here, banner.jpg, made simply by us adding the word .jpg to the end of this layer. Now if we disable some of these adjustment layers and come back into Adobe Generator, you'll see that the changes have been reflected in the file as well. So that's the advantage of using Adobe Generator. Now this is old. This is what we had in Photoshop CC before. The new addition in Photoshop CC 2014 is the ability to create subdirectories on the fly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to click on this layer and add the word images and slash. What this is going to do, this is going to create a folder titled images in our assets folder. So I'm going to bring my folder back up, and you'll see that now we have the PSD in the assets folder, and now instead of having the file, we have a folder titled images. If we open that up, we'll see the banner inside of that. So the new addition to Photoshop CC 2014 is the ability to create subdirectories on the fly. Another enhancement in Generator and Adobe Photoshop CC 2014 is the ability to create a default layer, which allows you to control all the other layers in this document. Let me show you what I mean by that. I'm just going to go all the way to the top. I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm just going to rename this layer default. Then I'm going to type in the word assets with a backslash, and this is going to tell Photoshop that all the files I generate from this document are going to go into a folder called assets. So we can try that. So I'm going to go back into the banner, and I'm just going to remove that images folder that we had added before and just delete that. And if we bring back our folder, we'll see that Photoshop created that assets folder and the banner is in that assets folder. So this default blank layer allows you to control all the other images that Generator generates. And if you want to see exactly how Generator works, feel free to watch my tutorial on Adobe Generator, where I use this mockup to show you how it all works. One of the most interesting enhancements in Adobe Photoshop CC 2014 is the ability to create lookup tables. And if you don't know what they are, I'll go ahead and quickly show you what they do. So in Photoshop, you can create a color lookup adjustment layer, and that is a LUT file that allows you to add these color styles to your layers. And these LUT files are usually used in video, but obviously in Photoshop you can use them with images. And Photoshop comes preloaded with these files here. Now with Photoshop CC 2014, we can create our own 3D LUT files using adjustment layers, and we can use them in Photoshop or in other video programs such as Adobe After Effects or Adobe Premiere. Now to create them is very simple. All you need is to create your own style using adjustment layers. If you're a subscriber to the Photoshop training channel, then you've probably seen this before. This is one of my subscriber only tutorials where I showed how to create this retro effect. If you're not a subscriber and you want to find out how I did this, then you can go ahead and subscribe now. Simply enter your email on my website and look in the subscriber only archive for this tutorial. But anyway, in the original tutorial I had more adjustment layers, but I only left the ones that gave this retro effect. I had another layer that gave noise, but that's not going to work for a color lookup table. So only adjustment layers will work for that. So I just went ahead and removed it, just in case you're wondering if you do follow that tutorial or you've seen it in the past. But anyway, so I have these adjustment layers that create this look. I can export that and make that into a color lookup table. So I can do so by going into File, Export, Color Lookup Tables, and you can give your color lookup a description. I'm just going to call it retro effect. I don't need the .psd copyright. I'm just going to use PTC. And the quality, I'm just going to leave it at high. If you bump it all the way up to maximum, it might take a while for your computer to export the lookup table and also to import it. I'm just going to leave mine at high. I'm going to press OK, and it's going to ask me where I want to save my .lut file, and I'm going to save it in the same folder where I have the PSD. I'm going to click on Save, and Photoshop created a new lookup table. Now to apply it, I'm going to go ahead and disable this first. To apply it, I'm going to create a new color lookup adjustment layer, and I'm going to select Load 3D LUT. Click on that, and it's going to bring up the window so I can load up my color lookup table. And here it is, retroeffect.cube. I'm going to click on Load. In Photoshop, it's going to take a minute, and then it's going to load that into this document. As you can see, Photoshop now took the same effect I had on all these adjustment layers and placed it in one color lookup file. So now I can use this color lookup anytime I want with any image in Photoshop or any video in After Effects or Premiere. In this video, we're going to talk about some of the new features in Adobe Photoshop CC 2014. Some of these features are minor, but I still think they can make a huge impact in your workflow. One of the first things I want to show you is the color palette, which is this palette here. It's on by default. The color picker area here is actually expandable, so you can make it as wide or as big as you want to. Obviously, the palette is attached to the panel here, but you can click and move that around if you want to. And again, it's scalable, so you can move that around and get a bigger area to choose your color from. So it's a little bit easier than clicking on the foreground and background color to pick your color. You also can click on the flyout menu here and choose different cubes, like the brightness cube, the grayscale slider. You also have RGB sliders, HSB sliders, CMYK sliders. lab and web color sliders. I like the hue cube slider. I'm just going to click and drag the color palette back into the panels. Another new addition is in the swatches panel. Photoshop remembers the last swatches that you use. So the swatches here are the previously used swatches. So for example, if I select this red color here, it'll add it there because it's the last one that I chose. And notice that as I click around, it just keeps adding the last used swatches. That way you can select the most recently used colors. Another new addition comes in the brush panel. The brush panel also shows you the most recently used brushes. So you have 7 choices. So for example, if I click on this brush and then paint, you'll notice that the brush panel now has this brush here as the last brush used. So actually this is pretty useful for me because usually when I work I tend to use a lot of brushes, and it's pretty convenient to have the recently used brushes up in this area. Another thing you can do with Photoshop CC 2014 is enable the experimental features. If you go to Edit, Preferences, or you press Control K, Command K on the Mac, you bring up the Preferences window, and you can click on Experimental Features, and you can enable these experimental features if you want to. If you want to learn more about a particular feature, just click on Learn More. One other new feature is with Liquify. If you go to Filter, Liquify, you have one new feature in the advanced mode here, which is the pin edges, and I'll try to show you how that works. If I click and drag the pixels over to the edge of the canvas there, the pixels go past the canvas, so they're somewhere out here. And if I try to drag them back, sometimes that can create problems. If I were to click on pin edges, I can click and drag those pixels, but they're not going past the edge. They're right there on the edge. You can kind of see how that works. Another way of showing you how that works, if I can drag these pixels all the way to the right here, and you'll notice that I get no transparency. That's because I'm pinning pixels to the edges. If I go ahead and click on that, you'll see the transparency. So this is one of the new features. The pixels on the edge are pinned, so you can't go past the canvas or into the canvas when you're using the Liquify tool. And those are some of the new workflow enhancements in Adobe Photoshop CC 2014. And that's it for this tutorial. As always, I hope that you enjoyed it and that you learned something new. If you have any questions, you can leave them down below. Also, don't forget to click the like button and share this tutorial with your friends. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.